Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm super excited to be chatting with you guys today, and wanted to go over a topic that I think is not really discussed a lot, but I was inspired to do this. I look at TikTok quite a bit, and so I was like, sometimes when I'm kind of scrolling through and trying to find interesting topics to touch on for the show, I get inspired to do these things. And so the inspiration for this show today definitely came from TikTok. But anyhow, what I wanted to discuss is, what abusive behaviors you may develop as a result of being exposed to narcissistic abuse, whether you grew up in a narcissistic household, whether you had narcissistic parents, or you were in a relationship, an intimate partnership with a narcissist, whether you work with a narcissist. So we could certainly develop abusive traits. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we're narcissists, but we can develop maladaptive traits as a result of being in abusive or toxic environments. And so I kind of want to talk about some of the traits that we develop as a result of being in abusive and toxic environments. So the first one that I want to mention is people pleasing, performing, auditioning, and basically, when we talk about people pleasing, we're basically putting on a show, right? And that's something that narcissists do, but victims are also sort of groomed to do this too as a result of narcissists. And I'm not saying that everyone who is a people pleaser grew up in a narcissistic environment, but what I am saying is for those people that have been in narcissistic environments or have been oppressed or abused by a narcissist, you were definitely taught or groomed to be a people pleaser and to sort of audition or perform and be someone that you're not for love, for any sort of crumb or semblance of love, validation, and acceptance. And what does that mean? It means that you cannot show up as your authentic self. It means that you have to, you don't want to cause any conflict. You don't want to cause any disagreement. You don't want anyone to think poorly of you. So you are going to present the very best version of yourself that you think that the other person would like or wants to have or wants the traits of. And so you're just kind of walking around or you're interacting with people with this version of yourself that lacks authenticity, right? Because you only want them to view you in a good way. And that is a form that is definitely a product of being in an abusive environment, so much so that you don't want to let your guard down. You don't want people to think poorly of you. You don't want people to leave or abandon you, and so, but it lacks authenticity. It's something that we have to work very hard at sort of keeping that facade up, right? And so it can be very challenging to live authentically and to show up in our relationships, friendships, or just our environment, authentically. And we may feel like, when you're people pleasing, you may also feel like you have to overachieve. You have to not make sure you don't rock the boat in any sort of way. And so that's one way that we can definitely show up inauthentically. Um, Avoidance and escapism is also something that narcissists really heavily engage in, ghosting, the silent treatment, um, being caught up in fantasy. And that's something that narcissists do very frequently and sort of playing things over and over in their mind. But we, as a product of abuse, avoidance and escapism is something that you can do, and that a lot of people do who grew up in abusive homes, or you're in an abusive environment where you have to walk on eggshells, and you don't really know quite what to expect. And there's your home. Or your work environment or wherever you are may lack a sense of safety. Um, and if you think about some of the ways we engage in avoidance and escapism as a victim of abuse, one of the ways that people may engage in this is by reading a lot. And I know that that may sound like, oh, reading is a toxic behavior. In and of itself, in moderation, it's not. But where you might want to look at it is if you were a victim who grew up in an abusive or chaotic home. A lot of times, people who do this may sink themselves into a book, 24/7, like their nose is in a book, because books have the power to sort of take you away to another place in your mind, right? They capture your mind, your imagination, and you get to escape and avoid for a little while. And another way that it's just a way to kind of distract your mind from the chaotic environment that you grew up in. Another way that we may engage in escape and avoidance behaviors might be something like substance abuse. Whereas you might think like, oh, I'm drinking casually, and occasionally I might binge drink sometimes, but that just sort of helps me to feel good. We may engage in things like retail therapy. And a lot of people found themselves kind of getting caught up with retail therapy, especially during COVID, when they were experiencing an insurmountable amount of stress, or they found themselves sort of in their home with an abusive partner. And retail therapy has become especially easy in today's time. You can literally click a button on Amazon and have something to your house. It might even be the very same day, that very same night, or the next day if you have Prime shipping. And so just sort of that buying things regularly and consistently, even though they may not be things that you need, but it just helps you feel good to get something in the mail every day. Like, ooh, I got this little thing. I got this item in a box, in a package, and that makes me feel good temporarily. And you might find that you open up the package, you might throw whatever it is you bought in a closet or a drawer or something somewhere, and you never use it. And you might find yourself doing that over and over again to get instant gratification, but it's a way of escapism. And I'm certainly not saying that's the case for everybody, but these are some maladaptive behaviors that exemplify avoidance and escapism, just things that help us to feel good, things that help us just get away from the monotony, from the chaos of what we have to go through every day when we come home and we're not feeling happy, right? So, other ways that avoidance can show up is avoidance of conflict. If you grew up in a household that had a lot of conflict, or if you're in a relationship with an abusive partner or someone, that is, that can escalate very quickly into physical or into high conflict. You might be more of a passive person and try to avoid conflict in your relationships, right? Because you've learned somewhere along the way, you've learned that conflict is like stepping on a landmine and it freaks you out and it does a disservice. So if you feel like, hey, I don't like having conflict, I don't like arguing, I don't like getting into it, you may be avoiding conflict. And here's the thing, unfortunately, what you've learned is that conflict can be very destructive. But in all actuality, conflict is very healthy for us to have in our relationships. And if it's done in a healthy way, conflict can be actually be very constructive, where it can help us learn more about our partners and it can help us learn how to adjust more healthily in our relationships with people because conflict is actually something that happens with everybody, but if you avoid having conflict at all costs, that means that your relationship cannot deepen. It means that it's surface level relationships, right? And that you don't get a chance to foster growth and connection on a much deeper level with your partner. You don't go, you avoid problems and you learn and that really helps to build a relationship and continues to foster deeper emotional intimacy in your friendships, your relationships, and things like that. So conflict is a natural part of everybody's life. But if you avoid that, unfortunately, you also avoid opportunities for growth and expansion in your relationships. And narcissists, even though they can be very chaotic, very argumentative, and downright dangerous sometimes. There's a lot of times when they actually try to avoid conflict, verbal conflict, right? And in what they do is they engage in that emotional battering or that emotional conflict through silent treatment, right? Or ghosting. So those are forms of emotional abuse. So just some notes there about that. Um, Reactive abuse is the third thing I want to talk about. And reactive abuse is essentially where a victim of abuse becomes the aggressor after experiencing abuse, right? So they actually become the aggressor against their abuser, right? By sort of hitting, kicking, pushing, pulling, or basically lashing out against their abuser. And the argument for a reactive abuse is that a victim has withstood so much abuse within the relationship that they snap, right? And then they sort of abuse the abuser, right, as a product of their environment. They sort of react to violence with violence. So they're reacting back. So reactive abuse is considered to be self-defense. And usually when a person is reacting back against their abuser, it's really after dealing with abuse for a long time and just finally just I snapped, I've had enough, and I'm lashing back out in a way that is protective, in a way that has become very familiar to me through your abusive actions. So essentially, I am just lashing out in any way that I can. And what's been used in legal cases more recently, or what's been used in legal cases has been, as a form of reactive abuse, but it's called battered woman syndrome. And woman syndrome, with respect to legal cases, it's when violence is used as a method of self-defense. And battered woman syndrome in legal cases hinges on the defense that, victims of violence have endured so much violence, and they react with violence as a form of self-defense. And it could be the violence that they sort of react with could possibly potentially result in death of the person who perpetrated violence against them. And so there are several stages of the battered woman syndrome. The first stage is denial, where the abused spouse doesn't want to believe inherently that their spouse is abusive towards them. The second stage would be guilt. The abusive spouse or partner is actually blaming blaming the victim of the abuse for the abuse. And so the victim of the abuser could believe that, the abuse is now happening because it's something that I've done. Therefore, the abuse is my fault. The third stage is enlightenment, and this happens when the victim of the abuse begins to understand that whatever it is that they're going through, the abuse that they're experiencing, it is in fact not their fault, and that they are coming to terms with the fact that their spouse is in fact the aggressor of violence, and that they, in fact, do not deserve to be abused. The fourth stage is responsibility. And in the responsibility stage, the victim realizes that their partner is really the only one or the only person that's actually responsible for the abuse that's happening in the relationship. During the responsibility stage, the victim of abuse will create a safety plan, seek support, counseling services, emotional support, from emotional support groups, and they'll try to regain control of their lives. And during this stage, is when they'll actually try to escape. And so, a lot of women who experience battered women syndrome tend to stay in relationships because they don't have any money or resources or support to escape. And so, it's again abuse when you don't have the means to escape a bad situation, or you feel like you don't have the resources. You are going to you might feel like you're stuck in that situation. Hence the person that sort of reacts by lashing back out towards their abuser with violent behavior. So violence begets violence, essentially, and you react out or you lash back out in the only way that you know. So in legal cases, battered women, it becomes battered woman syndrome becomes used as a legal defense, where women resort to harming or killing their partners because essentially they feel like they're backed into a corner and there's no way out of the relationship. And I think there's a movie that portrays battered woman syndrome. It's called it's a classic movie too. It's The Burning Bed, with Farrah Fawcett, where she had an abusive husband and it had been going on for years. And, one night she kind of left the home, by setting the house on fire. And so that's a classic movie that portrays, that's based on true events, where she burned her husband in the house, so on and so forth. Sorry if that is a spoiler alert for anybody, but since that movie's been out since I think the 70s or 80s, but it's a classic film that portrays battered woman syndrome. Another way that victims of abuse can display abusive behaviors is through intergenerational abuse. So I think I know that I've talked about this before, but where abuse is passed down generation through generation and families, excuse me. And so with intergenerational abuse, a lot of times what you'll hear, what I hear, I'll say that is what I hear with clients is like, I don't want to be anything like my mom. I don't want to be anything like my dad because they grew up maybe witnessing violence, witnessing or experiencing violence in their home. And so logically up here, they know that they don't want to be anything acting like their parent, but it doesn't translate, right? So even though they know logically that they don't want to be like their parents, a lot of times what ends up happening is they end up moving through relationships or interacting with their children very similarly to what their parents have done with them. So they may be physically aggressive or speaking harshly to their children or snapping very easily at their children, as a form of just like being abusive, right? And then there's other people too that I've talked to that don't like children, just have a strong distaste for small children. So if you grew up receiving messages in an abusive home that children were to be seen and not heard, or, children can sort of be pushed around, or that children are bad and, they don't like it when children do normal things like cry or become fussy or, have anger or, just, act out, misbehave and do other things, right? Things that may cause you to be stressed or may cause you to feel an emotion. There are people that sort of react with anger. And there's evidence that shows there's been psychological studies that show that this becomes especially high if you have children with a partner, and like if you become a single mother. Typically it's higher for mothers than for fathers, the stress or the duress of raising children alone. So basically what the studies show is that if we were partnered at one point and you and your partner decide to go separate ways, either through divorce or you just break up and you had children, that these behaviors of sort of reacting negatively or extending harsh consequences goes up during that period of separation for a while, when that initial stress of that breakup happens. There are also people that may be triggered by their children, when they've broken up with their partner. They may feel like their children look like their partner, may act like their partner, or say something, and that becomes a trigger point or a hot button issue. And again, it doesn't mean that you don't love your children, but it just means that there's stress there and you're much more reactive, and potentially may lash out much more aggressively or abusively towards your children during that time. So that's another way that, narcissistic abuse may have affected you, even within your own children, or in your own relationships. Another thing that I want to point out is black and white thinking in relationships, where it could be, all or nothing thinking, meaning that people are all good or all bad. There is no happy medium. And this happens a lot with victims of abuse and also perpetrators of abuse, is sort of that black and white thinking. And where it shows up with victims is, again, if you've been in relationships or you've grown up in abusive households, or you may have attracted partners that were very similar in abusive behaviors, one after the other, which is not uncommon, then you may be conditioned to think that, all men or all women are this or this, right? You frequently hear people say it, that all women are bitches, may be a commonality. All men are dogs, or they're not trustworthy. You may hear some of these common phrases where people continue to attract the same types of person, but they also continue the narrative of seeing things only one way in the relationship. And that may start to form the victimization, where you feel like you're always the victim in your relationships. People are always mistreating you, that you are never receiving fair treatment, right? And that can cause that spiral into overly identifying yourself with always being the victim in life. And so that's kind of where that black and white thinking can come from. And it's not to say that you are not necessarily the victim, but if you are the victim in every single situation in your life, then that's something that probably needs to be looked at a little bit more objectively. And you'll also notice that narcissistic people tend to do this too, where they overly identify with being the victim or the white knight in the relationship. So they either identify as like, oh, people are always doing this to me, and I'm always getting the bad end of the stick in relationships, or I'm always the one that people call on to rescue them or save them somehow. And so that could be a trait that's shared there. Other ways that this can show up, that these abusive behaviors can show up without necessarily you being narcissistic, but just sort of, something that you may have inherited from being abused, is one of the things that I've seen is just to use people. And again, you may not go into the relationship with the idea that I'm going to use someone per se, but it can come from the thinking like, oh, I'm going to get what I can out of this relationship, and I'm not going to really become emotionally invested because I know that that people are bad, and I just want to get what I can, and I don't want to become too deeply involved in this relationship. And it doesn't mean that, again, that you are a bad person, but it just may mean that I just want to get my basic needs met, and I don't want to overly involve myself with the potential of getting hurt, if that makes sense. In this way, you kind of want to do as much as you can to control the narrative and the outcome of the relationship. And so, because you're fearful that if you give too much of yourself to someone emotionally, if you start to express vulnerability, if you start to try to have emotional intimacy, there's a fear there that that person will misuse and abuse that, and you can't trust that. And so you're, again, this kind of goes back into the performative element. So it kind of loops back into that first point that I made there. But it's all about like not getting yourself too emotionally involved for fear that you will get hurt, or that you could turn and you could turn on me, and you could misuse things against me. You could not misuse. You could, well, yeah, you could use things against me that I've shared with you in confidence, right? And so you're unwilling to risk opening yourself up 100% here. And it's like, okay, well, I can get, maybe I can get my sexual needs met. Maybe I can get, just some of these basic needs met, or, maybe I can get the need met of just having company every once in a while, or sharing a dinner once in a while. But I'm not going to get too emotionally involved. I'm not going to get too emotionally attached with this. So this person just fulfills that need for me. And other than that, I don't really want them to have any real significance in my life. I don't want them to really know too much about me, or be too involved in my life. And I'm going to constantly be on guard and have my wall up and push them away when I feel like they're getting too close to me emotionally. They're trying to get too all up in my space. They're being too nosy. So we're going to keep this person at arm's length. And so that's how that can come up. Okay. All right. Well, I hope that this has been informative to you, and I enjoyed chatting with you tonight. And so until next time, you guys take care of yourselves and be well. Bye bye for now.